Today we're going to start part 3 of the 1920s, and part C here, or part 3, is going to focus on how rapidly American society is changing. We are no longer going to be a country composed mostly of farmers, but now America is going to be much more of an urban environment where most Americans are living in large major metropolitan areas, and they're going to have a much different lifestyle than they did in previous eras. So we're going to start with gangsters. The 1920s, of course, is famous for gangsters, and part of the reason for that is because of Prohibition. When Prohibition outlawed alcohol, people are still going to want to drink alcohol, and so there's going to be a large market for a commodity that is now scarcer because it's illegal to get. And so whenever you have a high demand and a low supply, you're going to have large profits. This large illegal profit is going to attract people who are known as the mafia, or organized crime. We're going to see lots of the new immigrants coming into America, and some of those new immigrants are Italians. And some of the Italians are from Sicily, and they bring over what is known as the mafia to the United States, where we see organized crime families use illegal activities to make a massive fortune. The most famous of these in the 1920s is Alphonse, or Al Capone. He is going to make his mark in Chicago, which is going to be named Gangland at this time. And it's going to be his job, or his goal, to control the illegal activities in large sections of the city of Chicago. And so the three big things that he's going to do is he's going to control the production and sale of alcohol, of course, prostitution, and also the protection racket, which means he's going to make stores and businesses pay him so that he doesn't burn them down or blow them up. And so because of this, he's going to become a very powerful, wealthy man. And so we see his gang is going to be fighting other gangs in the city to control certain neighborhoods. Whoever controls the neighborhood controls all the illicit, illegal activity in that neighborhood. And the most famous example of this gang violence in Chicago is known as the St. Valentine's Day Massacre. The St. Valentine's Day Massacre is where Al Capone's men, dressed up as police officers, they go and arrest members of the rival gang, and the members of the rival gang don't think anything of this. You know, they got arrested all the time, and they just had to bribe police officers or judges, and they would be let right back out of jail. But these weren't real police officers. They were Al Capone's men, and they take them to a warehouse instead of the police station, and they gun them down in cold blood. And so this is an example of some of this violence we see in the roaring 20s in these cities, where we have violence occurring between some of these immigrant groups as they come in and fight for control using Prohibition to make their fortune. Eventually, Al Capone is going to be arrested, and it's not for the murders that he had committed or the prostitution that he controls or some of this protection stuff. He's actually going to get in trouble with the IRS, the Internal Revenue Service, because he's not paying taxes. You can't say to the IRS, look, here's all my money, I'm going to pay taxes on this stuff that I did illegally. So eventually he'll be sent to Alcatraz, which was the maximum security prison in the United States, and he will spend a good chunk of time in Alcatraz serving out his sentence. Next, we're going to see sports. Sports becomes a major thing in America in the 1920s. In the past, sports was more of a participatory thing. People love sports, and they went and played it in their leisure time. But now in the 1920s, sports has become a big business. And we're going to see that sports becomes more a spectator thing than it is a participatory thing. And the reason this happens is because of technology. We have the radio now, and so millions of Americans can follow the Yankees, even though they live nowhere near New York, because they can follow it on the radio. And so we get celebrity. We get people known all across America who become part of popular culture or pop culture. And so people even in Colorado could become Yankee fans, watching Babe Ruth or the Sultan of Swat collect his home runs. Of course, the reason it was advertised so much is because there's an audience, or broadcast so much because there's an audience. And if there's an audience, then we're going to see NBC, CBS, ABC, those broadcasting companies use sports to sell more advertising, which in turn is going to spur more business growth. If I'm Crest toothpaste or Pepsodent, I can reach now a huge audience. Instead of just putting it in a newspaper, I can put my ad on the radio, and we can meet. I can have millions of people get introduced to my product. So sports on the radio is going to help actually make business grow. Another major sport of the time that becomes a spectator sport is going to be boxing. Boxing is going to be big at this time. We have our hero, Jack Dempsey. He becomes another hero in popular culture, a very good boxer, and he's famous for having the first $1 million gate. In other words, sports has become so big that this one event, one of his boxing matches, is going to raise $1 million, and that's the first time that's ever happened in America because of a sporting event or an entertainment event. We also see football become something of a popular sport that people like to watch. When it started, football was really just something that the super elite played at those Ivy League colleges. Harvard versus Yale is one of the first games that we see played in the United States, and then over time it will get spread to other colleges like Notre Dame. Here we see the famous Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse. That was their nickname, four very good football players from Notre Dame at the time. And so again, thanks to radio, sport is becoming more and more popular as a spectator entertainment. Next, we see urbanization. One of the major things advanced placement wants you to know is that the United States is becoming, again, more and more urbanized. The American experience is changing. Up to 1920, most Americans, according to census, lived in rural areas. They lived in small towns or they lived on farms. But now in 1920, most Americans, for the very first time, according to the 1920 census, are going to live in cities. New York, Chicago, those kinds of places. And that fundamentally changes the American experience. People live on the countryside, have a much different outlook on life and morals and values and lifestyle than people who live on the countryside or in the farm. So, how does all of these changes that we are going to see in the 1920s affect women? Of course, as we've gone through this class, we've seen this has been a major theme in American history, from Republican motherhood to the cult of domesticity to all of those women-leading reform movements. And in the 1920s, we're going to see women cut loose a little bit. They're going to build on the Gibson girl or the new woman and the new morality of the Gilded Age, and they're going to expand that. And so we see that women, because of World War I, again, a lot of women did go back to the home after World War I, but still it's going to overall elevate women in the workforce. And so women now have their own income. And if you have your own income, your husband, your father, whatever, they cannot control you because you are paying for your life, you're paying for your rent. And so we're seeing women leave the countryside and go to work in cities, and they have their own money, and so they're able to control their own life. So without male supervision, we see that their lifestyle changes. So we get this new group of women in the 1920s, famously called flappers. These are young women, urban and single, and always working. They have to be working because they have to support their lifestyle. They have to be single because if they have a husband, they're probably going to, start having kids. And women who have kids can't go out till all hours of the evening partying. Obviously urban, because if you're living in a countryside, you're going to be surrounded by your father or your husband, and they're not going to want you to do this. And of course, very young. They're not going to be married yet. And so we see these flappers are young women who just want to enjoy their life. They have their own money. And so they go out and they party, they drink, they get blotto, as they would say at the time, they get drunk. And so we see this woman up in the top picture. She's dancing with what would call a sugar daddy. A sugar daddy is going to be an older man. He may be married. He may not be married. And he is going to give you gems and jewels and dresses and take you on trips because, he wants to have your company, whatever that would entail. And so we see women enjoying life and certainly not partaking in the cult of domesticity. The next thing we see is there's going to be changes to women's fashion. And believe it or not, this is a branch of history where we talk about fashion history, and it can tell us a lot about society, how women or people dress. And so we're taking a look at a picture down here in the bottom of women in the Gilded Age. We see women, they are covered from neck all the way to foot, and they have long sleeves, and they usually wore gloves because showing a lot of skin was not something that was considered proper for a mother or for a daughter, somebody in the cult of domesticity. But in the 1920s, that all changes. And so for these flappers, they want to say that we are not in the cult of domesticity. If we look at women back in the Gilded Age, they were designed to have curves. They wore these things called
called corsets. It was fit around their waist, and it cinched their waist to impossibly narrow degrees. And so it created curves, and people associated curves with motherhood. It's easier if you have curves, or if you have larger hips, it's easier to have children. If you're larger, well endowed up above, that means that you can feed the children. And so we see that curves represented the cult of domesticity. And so these flappers, they're saying, I am not in the cult of domesticity by the clothes they chose to wear. And so instead of wearing outfits with curves, flappers wear dresses that hang straight on their body because they are de-emphasizing their curves. They are saying by their outfit, their attire, that I'm rebelling, I'm not in the cult of domesticity. Next, we see women that are in the cult of domesticity. It's very feminine to have long hair. And so flappers would cut their hair short to appear more masculine or boyish, and they would again say, look, this is a symbol. I'm not going to be a mother anytime soon. I'm not in the cult of domesticity. And then, oddly enough, while they're trying to have a more slimmer shape and get rid of curves, de-emphasize that they're going to be a mother someday, what they do is, however, they will show more skin. And so we see these women here with their stockings rolled down to show more skin, their hemlines up, their necklines get further down, and they're not wearing sleeves. And so the net effect is we're showing a lot more skin, which was scandalous at the time. Good women were not supposed to do this kind of behavior. And so in their dress and their actions, we see that these flappers are really symbolic of the 1920s. It's all about breaking traditions, breaking with the past, and changing the way we live our lives. Now, most women, of course, are not flappers. A large percent of the women are still living in the countryside. Most of them are older, they're married, they're not working outside the home, and so most women are not flappers. But even the flapper fashions are going to affect how other women dress. We see these women of the 1920s who are living in the countryside. They're certainly a little bit older, they're mothers, and their dresses certainly look more like flappers than they did like women from the Gilded Age. They're wearing long, kind of straight dresses. Their neckline is a little bit lower. They still have sleeves, and their hemline is not as high up as their daughters may be. But we see that all women are being affected of this new lifestyle to some degree or another. Another thing that women start to pioneer is by also having control of their own economy, another thing that they want to be able to do to control their lives is to control their reproductive systems. And so we have a lady by the name of Margaret Sanger. Margaret Sanger, she is a pioneer in the area of birth control. She wants to go around to female audiences around the United States and talk to them about all the different options they have for birth control. She figures that if women can control their own reproductive system, decide when to have a baby or when not to have a baby, that they'll be able to control their lives. And so when she does this, of course, this is not something that is talked about in public, birth control. And so when she goes to different cities, her venues are canceled by the local government. She is, not attacked by mobs, but certainly ridiculed by mobs. In a couple of cases, she's thrown in jail. And so here she is in this picture, and she's protesting. She's saying, America is trying to gag me. And so it's symbolic. They're not letting me talk about birth control. And so we certainly see that women in many ways are changing the way they're viewed and they're experiencing life. In addition to that, we also see political changes for women. If you remember that women got the vote at the very end of the Progressive Era, and so now women are experiencing not just economic freedom and a little bit of more social freedom, but they also have political power as well. We see women start to vote in presidential elections in 1920. So to do that, we see, since women now have the vote, they want to make things equal for themselves. And so the National Women's Party, it's a party dedicated for women's issues, they demand that the Constitution be amended, and we get something called the Equal Rights Amendment, or the ERA. The Equal Rights Amendment is going to make it illegal to discriminate against women based on gender. So you can't fire people because they're women, or refuse to hire them because they're women, or treat them differently because of their gender. Now, this doesn't pass. It's just too radical for the time. In fact, it still hasn't passed in America today. There are plenty of laws on the books today that you can't discriminate based on gender, but it has never become part of the United States Constitution. So let's now move to something slightly different. We're going to talk about Dr. Sigmund Freud. He is a psychologist of the time, and we don't have to get into all of his theories, but we certainly will talk about his major theories that help justify some of this behavior we see among women and young men in the time period. Freud comes up with this idea that the brain is a lot like an iceberg.
that only the tip of the iceberg we are aware of, but there's a lot of stuff underneath the surface. And so if we picture the brain like an iceberg, he says the top that's showing of the iceberg or your brain is your conscious brain, your waking brain. It is what guides your behavior. It's the conscious, rational thought of yourself. And before Freud, most people in the West would think that, well, I'm rational, I control my decisions, I decide if I want to get up in the morning and go to school or work, I'm making conscious decisions. But Freud took issue with that. He said that no, most of the decisions we make are made by our unconscious, our subconscious. And our subconscious really craves some very simple things. It doesn't care about a lot, but what it does care about is that you have food and shelter and basic needs. And one of those basic needs is sex. He says that Americans, or anybody, if you want to be a healthy individual, what you need to do is you need to give your body the subconscious things that it demands. Food, shelter, other things, and then sex. And so he says if you deny yourself any of those things, if you deny yourself food, you're not going to be a healthy person. Same with water, same with shelter, and same with sex. And so Freud, who was very controversial at the time, when he comes out and says that human beings need sex and that we shouldn't deny ourselves them, we shouldn't let morality get in the way, this, of course, seems to justify the new bohemian lifestyle. Bohemian lifestyle is another way of expressing the idea of this flapper lifestyle or the roaring 20s lifestyle, right? That you should be free to do what feels good. What feels good is what is good. It's your body's way of saying this is what we need to do. And so this whole Sigmund Freud idea of how we should live our lives in a bohemian lifestyle, it certainly represents the 1920s, a carefree, break traditions of the past kind of attitude, and just go out and do what feels good. Next, we get a kind of music that evolves at this time. And once again, this music known as jazz is going to typify the age. It has a lot in common with Freud. Jazz is a kind of music. It is going to start with African Americans down in the South, specifically in and around New Orleans. And as African Americans move north during the Great Migration, during World War I and then after, looking for better pay, better jobs, less discrimination, they're going to bring their music with them. And so one of the most prominent musicians of this time is Louis Armstrong, a great trumpet player. And we're going to see that jazz is a music that represents the time. Just like Freud, you have to do what feels good. And so if you're a musician, don't worry about written music on a page. Just pick up an instrument and start playing, and whatever comes out is right. You can't have good or bad music. It's just whatever comes out. Don't worry about the time or the measure. Don't worry about the beat. Just start playing, and that kind of subconscious music will come out. And so we see another nickname for the 1920s besides the Roaring 20s is the Jazz Age. Don't worry about rules that we've had in music. Break that tradition. Just go out and do what feels good. And so again, it's kind of representative of the 1920s, the Jazz Age. Now, lots of African Americans, what they'll do is, during the Great Migration, they'll move north into cities like Chicago and New York, and one of the neighborhoods in New York is known as Harlem. So this is going to be one of the main centers of jazz at the time, as well as Detroit and Chicago and St. Louis and places like that. Now, where are these jazz musicians playing? A lot of them are playing in these secret bars known as speakeasies. Of course, alcohol is illegal at this time, and so you can't advertise. You can't say, come in here and enjoy Joe's bar. And so what you have to do is you have to have kind of a secret bar. And so the entrance might be in a dark alley somewhere. People will come down the alley. They'll knock on the door, and the little part of the door will slide open, and they'll say, what do you want? And you'll give them the password, and you go from a dungy alley into an amazing club with palm trees and drinks, and jazz musicians playing and people dancing. People are enjoying the 1920s, and they have to do it in secret in the speakeasy because it's illegal to have alcohol. And so we see that a lot of white audiences are going to get introduced to African American music known as jazz at this time. This is a trend in American history. When we get to the 1950s, we'll see African American music have what we call rock and roll. And that's going to start with African Americans and then spread to white audiences. In the 1980s, we're going to have another type of African American music, rap, which will become popular and spread to white audiences. And so we see this certainly as a synthesis or a trend over time. The Cotton Club is one of the most famous places that we see in New York where African Americans, jazz musicians will go and play. So it would be a nice thing to put in an essay to talk about just part of the jazz age, and guys like Louis Armstrong would play at the Cotton Club. Continuing on, since we've been talking about African Americans and jazz,
let's talk about what African Americans are doing in the 1920s. Again, if you remember back going to the Gilded Age, there were two views by African Americans of how they can lead a better life, a more fulfilling life, reach the American dream. One was W.E.B. Du Bois, and he said that we should have political rights, founded the NAACP, the Talented Tenth, all of that. The other one was Booker T. Washington, and he said African Americans should focus on economic gains. So that was the Gilded Age. So what are African Americans in the 1920s focusing on? And that is really going to be centered in Harlem. We get something called the Harlem Renaissance, where a vibrant African American culture develops in northern cities, but especially in Harlem. And we're going to see that the Harlem Renaissance is all about celebrating being black in America, saying that we have a culture as African Americans that we should be proud of, that we are an amazing people, and we should celebrate that. And you could certainly call this a new period in African American history, or a turning point. Before, in this course, we've talked a lot about African Americans have struggled to survive, have created communities and families, led the abolition movement, those kinds of things. But the African American experience has been mostly Southern up to this point. It's been certainly very rural. It's been lots of poverty, not a lot of education. And so in the Harlem Renaissance, we see that African Americans are now going to have a much different experience. It's going to be more urban. It's going to be, it's in the North, and they're going to start to celebrate themselves. And Renaissance means a rebirth, a re-energy. So African Americans are going to say during the Renaissance that we are amazing and that we should celebrate our culture. And so the first person we're going to talk about is perhaps the most important author, poet of the time period for the Harlem Renaissance. His name is Langston Hughes, and here we see him typing away, writing poetry. And one of his poems that he writes is called The Negro Speaks of Rivers in 1921. So let's read it, and as we read it, let's think about what it really represents. So he says, he's talking as an African American, I've known rivers. I've known rivers ancient as the world and older than the flow of human blood in human veins. My soul has grown deep like rivers. I bathed in the Euphrates when the dawns were young. I built my hut near the Congo, and it lulled me to sleep. I look upon the Nile and raised the pyramids above it. I heard the singing of the Mississippi when Abe Lincoln went down to New Orleans, and I've seen its muddy bosom turn all golden in the sunset. I've known rivers, ancient dusky rivers. My soul has grown deep like the rivers. And as we see in this poem, he's saying that we should be celebrating being African Americans. We have been around since ancient times. We've been around since the first civilizations along the Tigris and Euphrates. We helped build the pyramids. We've been a part of American history even before Abe Lincoln. And so he's saying we should be celebrated. We are part of the American experience, and we should be happy and supportive of ourselves and celebrate ourselves, celebrate being black in America. Another poem that he writes is called Harlem, or sometimes referred to as Dream Deferred. And so his dream, of course, is to have success in America, to be equal and to be happy and to live a life that he wants to live without prejudice and discrimination. So he says, what happens to a dream deferred? His dream, what happens when it's put off by white America? Does his dream dry up like a raisin in the sun, or fester like a sore and then run? Does it stink like rotten meat, or crust and sugar over like a syrupy sweet? Or maybe it just sags under a heavy load. Or does it explode? So, what an interesting poem. I think many of you are familiar with the book, A Raisin in the Sun, which certainly comes from this poem. But he's talking about the African American dream, as we said, and do you let it get it down? Does it sag like a heavy load? Are we never going to get our dream? It's kind of a warning, a clarion call to white America and to maybe fellow African Americans that don't let your dreams go. Don't put it off. Don't defer it. Don't keep us down, white America, or we might explode. So he's encouraging Americans, sorry about that, he's encouraging African Americans to continue dreaming, to continue striving for more.
Next, still part of the Harlem Renaissance, we get another leader. His name is Marcus Garvey. He is going to found an organization called the United Negro Improvement Association. You see him here in this picture in the big hat on the right. Marcus Garvey is known as a black nationalist. A nationalist means that you want your people to control their own lives. And so if you're a black nationalist, what Marcus Garvey says is he says, we have reached a point as African Americans where we shouldn't let white people determine how we live our lives. We should control our own lives. And so one of the things that he advocates is the Back to Africa movement, where he says that African Americans, you can't necessarily live in white America anymore. It's just too much discrimination, too much poverty, too much racism. And so he encourages African Americans to move back to Africa. Now, we've seen this before during the American Colonization Society, where abolitionists created Liberia as a colony for African Americans to repatriate or move back to Africa. And that wasn't a success because most African Americans don't know anything about Africa. They haven't been there in 100 years. And the same thing is true here. A lot of African Americans don't follow the Back to Africa movement. So Marcus Garvey says, fine. And so what he then promotes is separatism. Segregation, really. He says that African Americans should not live among white people because we're never going to get a fair shake from them. And so he says that we should live in all black communities like Harlem or the south side of Chicago. And he says that we should support one another. We should build our communities together. We should, when we're going to the store, we should go to a store owned by a fellow black person in our community. We should bank at African American banks. We should depend on one another because we can help each other out. We can't depend on white America to do that. And so that's separatism or black nationalism by Marcus Garvey. But there is one final movement we need to talk about during the Harlem Renaissance, and it's called the New Negro. The New Negro is this idea that from this point forward, African Americans are no longer going to be denied education. The new Negro is going to be educated. He's going to be economically successful. He's going to be urban. He's going to be northern. And he is going to demand equality. And so we see that this, just like we saw the new woman back in the Gilded Age, we see that the 1920s is certainly a time of breaking traditions here for African Americans as well. They are demanding a share at the table. They are demanding to be treated equally and have economic success. So let's now move on to literature. We had talked about previously about this idea of a lost generation. So many young men are killed during World War I, both in Europe and the United States, that literally there's a lost generation, a whole group of young men who will never reach adulthood or old age because they've been killed because of the war. And certainly that's part of what the lost generation means. But to a bigger extent, the lost generation is more metaphorical. It's figurative. It's that since World War I was so destructive and such a loss, and caused so much disillusion, we were promised that democracy would make things better, that America would make the world a better place, that we could fix our cities, that we could make the world better, end empire, do all of these things, and none of those happened. And so a man by the name of H.L. Mencken is going to be the father of this movement, and since he's so disappointed or disillusioned with America and the world, he says everything we once knew, throw it out the window. It didn't lead to a better world. Question everything. Everything that you thought was great about America, is it? Question it. Middle-class values. Did it make us into a better society, or did we become one of the countries involved in World War I and create just as much disharmony and discord and death and destruction? Did democracy help us avoid World War I? He would say no. Did patriotism lead us to anything positive? No, it created empire. It created imperialism. It created World War I. Marriage, is that something that's really making us better? He is going to question all what we traditionally hold as positive American values, and he's going to say maybe those aren't good. And so he is going to, once again, it's an example of the 1920s. We are breaking with the past challenging tradition. And so some of the people that fit into this idea of the lost generation, some of the authors that follow H.L. Mencken's advice, is F. Scott Fitzgerald. He writes a book called The Great Gatsby. I'm sure you've read it. And in that book, he is being critical of society. He is saying that America is just about materialism and partying and wealth, and what does it get you at the end of the book? Nothing. It brings death and disappointment and disillusionment. And so just like H.L. Mencken, he's critical of the society that he lives in. He's lost. He doesn't know where he should be. What should America be about? What should he believe in? And so he is trying to discover himself and what he should believe in. Next, we see Ernest Hemingway, and he writes a book called A Farewell to Arms, which certainly is very critical of conflict, of war. If you remember, before World War I, Woodrow Wilson said that war is going to make the world a better place. It's a progressive crusade, that we're going to end empire, all of those things. And Ernest Hemingway says that's nonsense. War is just evil. It's bad. It causes death and destruction. So he certainly is critical of governments in the West and how they have not made things better. And then the final book we can use as an example of the writers of the Lost Generation is William Faulkner. William Faulkner is going to write a book called The Sound and the Fury. The Sound and the Fury is a book about the South, and we see this plantation on the front. And he says that the South is a society that's corrupt. It's a society that only focuses on racism, on discrimination, and certain rigid class. And he says that it is just, again, he's critical of his society, and it's a society that is just, it's not worthwhile. It's not something that we should celebrate and focus on. Next, we see poets of this time of the Lost Generation. And just like the authors of the time, these poets are going to say, to heck with tradition. They're going to throw out rules of grammar. They're going to throw out rules of poetry. Rhyme, it doesn't have to rhyme. Doesn't have to be meter in poetry. It doesn't even have to necessarily be about anything that you can understand. And so here we see E.E. Cummings. Notice how he spells his name. He says, I'm not going to follow the rules of grammar because the rules of the past didn't lead us to anything positive. And so here's one of his poems, Buffalo Bill's Defunct, who used to ride a water smooth silver stallion and break 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 pigeons just like that. Jesus, he was a handsome man. And what I want to know is, how do you like your blue-eyed boy, Mr. Death? Yeah, it's an interesting poem. What is it about? And E.E. Cummings doesn't necessarily need to define that for you. He says, my poetry can define itself. What does it mean to you as the listener? He, just like jazz, believes in letting your subconscious out. Stream of consciousness writing. Don't worry about grammar. That slows you down. Don't worry about rhyme and meter and diction. It doesn't matter. Whatever your subconscious is telling you need to get it out on page. And that will really speak to the people that need to listen to it. So very much within this time period of the 1920s, break rules, criticize society, break with the past, and just try to figure out what America should really be about. So when we come back, we will talk about the response to all of these changes in society.